The beginning of the story, as well as in Game of Thrones, Ned Stark's hype is gassed up to an unrealistic place. In the early chapters of the first book, we're falsely led to believe that Ned bested the greatest fighter in the Seven Kingdoms in his heyday. Then in the show, we see a pretty lengthy clash between Ned and Jaime, where they seem evenly matched before being interrupted, which is impressive because Jaime is supposed to be the current era's best fighter. So a lot of readers and viewers were left asking, how skilled was Ned in his prime? He is a fan favorite, so everyone's gotta know more. Both of the moments I just talked about are very misleading. Ned never shared what truly transpired during the fight with Arthur Dayne, but every character knows it was 7 Northerners versus 3 members of the Mad King's Kingsguard. I don't know how anyone would come to the conclusion that the fight was in single combat. In the case with Ned vs. Jaime in the first season, the show writers just decided to add in some creative liberties to make for an exciting scene. That clash never happened in the books. In the original story, Jaime just commands his men to capture Ned, then rides off. There's no clash, no Lannister soldier thrusting his spear into his leg. But Ned does have a pretty horrific leg break after his horse slips in the rain. That's how he was apprehended. So to figure out the real answer, you gotta look to the past. And lucky for us, this part of the lore is densely detailed. But even then, we don't get a good look at Ned in action. He's overshadowed by his foster brother, Robert Baratheon, in every battlefield. And before he was forced into any wars, it was his actual older brother, Ned Stark, that took all the spotlight. Ned spent his childhood mostly in the Vale, being fostered by Jon Arryn along with Robert. But as he got older, he split his time there with his home, Winterfell. Ned had 2 giant meatheads to compete with in the training yard, so they must have toughened him up, though there's no way he stood a chance against each one of them, regardless of the weapon. Ned's childhood died at the age of 18, when the Targaryens put a target on the Stark family. This year started off exciting for Ned. He was traveling down from the Vale to attend what was going to be the biggest tourney ever, hosted at Harrenhal, the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms. But Ned didn't have a taste for violence or glory, so just sat back as a spectator, while his older brothers showed off their skills. Robert surprisingly lost in the melee, and Brandon was unhorsed in his jousting tilt with Rhaegar Targaryen. A great tourney fighter doesn't always correlate to real-world applications, because there's so much more that comes into play during a life-and-death situation. But this tourney made it clear that the greatest fighters during this era were Barristan Selmy, Arthur Dayne, and Rhaegar Targaryen. Robert and Brandon had the size and strength, but the former 3 were just pure skill and talent. I shouldn't make it seem like Robert was just a brute, because he did have some really good fighting instincts. Rhaegar was able to beat out his lifelong competitors and win the tourney at Harrenhal. When he crowned Lyanna Stark the Queen of Love and Beauty over his own wife that mothered his children, Brandon Stark almost lunged at the prince, thinking it was an insult to his younger sister. He had to be restrained before he did something he would regret. Soon after, Rhaegar disappeared with Lyanna, and there was no one who could restrain Brandon. He rode to King's Landing, demanding justice for his sister and for Rhaegar to come out and die, but the prince was long gone. It was only his father, the Mad King, inside their castle to hear his threats. So the king had Brandon imprisoned and called down his father, Lord Rickard Stark, to answer for his crimes. The Mad King cruelly had the 2, father and son, executed, and then went after Ned and Robert in case they would come looking for retribution. He ordered Lord Jon Arryn to send the heads of his 2 young foster sons, which kicked off Robert's rebellion. Robert would have went to war simply for the fact that his betrothed and love of his life, Lyanna, was taken by Rhaegar, so he wasn't going to bow quietly when ordered to die. This is why I said their time of youth was over. Ned was now expected to lead the entire North as a large portion of the army fighting against their king, a guy who has never been in a single battle. Northerners are different than the rest of the fighters in the Seven Kingdoms. The whole custom of knighthood is a religious thing practiced in the South, so Ned didn't have these aspirations. He lacked his brother's fighting spirit, but was the better war commander of the 2. Something the author George Martin had to come out and say when asked about Ned's fighting capabilities. He wasn't built for the front lines. Instead, he stayed back to give orders, though he was trained to use a sword if need be. He participated in 2 of the bigger battles during Robert's rebellion, the Battle of the Bells and the Battle of the Trident. Ned was a little late to join the party because first he had to sneak his way back to the north to rally his bannermen, while Robert was already making a name for himself as a hero in multiple different battlefields. But Ned is remembered as the hero of the Battle of the Bells. Stony Sept was the biggest town Arya had seen since King's Landing, and Harwin said her father had won a famous battle here. The Battle of the Bells, they called it after. Robert always said your father won it, not him. Robert was left stranded without his portion of the army when the Mad King's men came looking for him in the Riverlands. And Ned, along with the Tullys, came in the nick of time. In this major battle, we get all the feats of Robert, killing 6 men and coming out of hiding while still recovering from an injury, but no mention of what Ned accomplished. He did manage to walk away injury-free, which doesn't really help at all that much when we're trying to scale where Ned lies in the swordsman department. The exact same thing would happen in his next major battle on the Trident. Robert essentially won the war here by killing Rhaegar Targaryen in single combat, scattering the opposition. Ned wasn't hurt here either, and he didn't distinguish himself on the battlefield. Robert received another injury in the fight with Rhaegar, so tasked Ned with hunting down the rest of the Loyalists, making their way back to King's Landing. Ned made it through the capital's walls without a fight because of the Lannisters coming to their aid. I was still mounted. I rode the length of the hall in silence, between the long rows of dragon skulls. It felt as though they were watching me somehow. I stopped in front of the throne, looked at him. His golden sword was across his legs, its edge red with a king's blood. My men were filling the room behind me. Lannister's men drew back. I never said a word. I looked at him, seated there on the throne, and I waited. At last, Jaime laughed and got up. He took off his helm, and he said to me, "Have no fear, Stark. I was only keeping it warm for our friend Robert. It's not a very comfortable seat, I'm afraid." Ned was clearly prepared to fight Jaime and his men, depending on how he responded. Ned was being a little overly judgmental here, not realizing Jaime had no interest in the throne. It was just a 17-year-old that only moments earlier slit the throat of the king he swore to defend.
Doc, you think the Honorable Ned Stark wanted to hear my side? He judged me guilty the moment he set eyes on me.
Jaime would have easily taken out Ned if Judgy Stark did charge at him instead of handling things with an old-school stare-down. I do think Ned's men did vastly outnumber the Lannisters, because they were all scattered throughout the city and castle during this time, sacking the whole place under Tywin's orders. This wasn't the only instance where Ned prepped for a fight that never came. Ned and Robert got into their first serious disagreement after the war was won. Robert was okay with Tywin ordering the deaths of Rhaegar's innocent young children, horrifying Ned. But there were still things that needed to be handled in the aftermath of the rebellion. The Tyrell army held Storm's End in a siege, while everyone else was fighting in the Seven Kingdoms. The moment Ned showed up, they dropped their swords and backed off. No sense in continuing a lost cause. Ned's only true test with a sword was on Dorne, looking for his missing sister. After every battle he was involved in, he was left asking, where are 3 characters that could have swayed the momentum of the war? Members of the Kingsguard, Sir Arthur Dayne, Sir Oswell Went, and their Lord Commander, the older and very experienced Sir Gerald Hightower. This entire time, they were guarding over Lyanna Stark in a place Rhaegar had named the Tower of Joy before he died. Ned traveled here with 6 of his closest companions, all noble northerners, including the small but brave Howland Reed. Both parties respected each other because Ned knew they were only doing their duty. After a quick exchange of words, their swords came out, and the 7 Northerners fought the most skilled and trained fighters. The only thing Ned shares from this fight is, the finest knight I ever saw was Sir Arthur Dayne, who fought with a blade called Dawn, forged from the heart of a fallen star. They called him the Sword of the Morning, and he would have killed me but for Howland Reed. Father had gotten sad then, and he would say no more. Bran wished he had asked him what he meant. We don't know which of the Kingsguard Ned was able to slay, if any. He purposely kept what transpired ambiguous, even though Howland Reed was the only other man to walk out of there alive. He has never left his swamp castle since, likely because no one would go looking for him in the neck, or would even find him if they wanted to. Outnumbering the Kingsguard 7-3 really shows how far they were in terms of skill. A very different story compared to the rumors spread around Winterfell afterwards. Catelyn heard her maids repeating tales they heard from the lips of her husband's soldiers. They whispered of Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, deadliest of the 7 knights of Aerys Kingsguard, and of how their young lord had slain him in single combat. Fake news. This battle wasn't much of a feat for Ned, considering 5 of his companions didn't even make it out of there. Nothing like what Robert did to Rhaegar on the Trident. Ned, in fact, has never been mentioned to be caught up in a single combat fight to the death. If the Kingsguard of this era are the highest tier of swordsmanship, I think Brandon Stark is one level below them, and then Ned another below him, and the average Highborn Castle trained fighter under Ned. Surviving all these battles has to prove something, right? Even if his men were doing their best to keep their liege lord alive. Ned's sister was gone, and he was able to make amends with Robert over their grief of losing Lyanna. After the rebellion, a small period of peace lasted in the Seven Kingdoms before the Greyjoys got a little ahead of themselves. The Ironborn have always pestered the realm, specifically the north and the western coast, with raids, but this time it was a full-blown rebellion. 6 years after Robert's rebellion, Ned and Robert were reunited on the Iron Islands to crush their stupid rebellion that had no chance of succeeding. Just look at how small this area is compared to the mainland. 0 chance. Robert and Ned fought side by side here, but again, no feats for Ned, other than the mention of he helped crush the rebellion and walk out of the islands alive. During this short war, Jorah Mormont would be knighted by the king himself, an uncommon thing for a northerner to partake in, being one of the only few northerners who cared enough to get the title of knight. The next confrontation Ned faced was with the newly knighted Sir Jorah Mormont. Jorah was caught selling slaves to collect some gold and make his bougie wife satisfied. So Ned sailed over to Bear Island to execute him for his crimes. He carried that big old Valyrian greatsword over there, only to find Jorah long gone. He had no interest in fighting Ned or losing his head that day, just like the Tyrells back at Storm's End. 10 years later is the moment he would have to fight with his sword again in the streets of King's Landing, the day his leg was broken. Ned lost 3 of his guards that night, but together with his men, 5 Lannister soldiers would die in return. No, Ned Stark screamed, clawing for his sword. Jaime was already cantering off down the street as he heard Will shout. Men closed from both sides. Ned rode one down, cutting at phantoms in red cloaks, who gave way before him. Jory Castle put his heels into his mount and charged. A steel-shod hoof caught a Lannister guardsman in the face with a sickening crunch. A second man was reeling away, and for an instant, Jory was free. Will cursed as they pulled him off his dying horse, sword slashing in the rain. Ned galloped to him, bringing his longsword down on Traeger's helm. The jolt of the impact made him grit his teeth. Traeger stumbled to his knees, his lion crest sheared in half, blood running down his face. He may have killed 2 Lannister guards himself, but they were ordered not to harm him. Ned would never hold a sword again. His head was taken soon after, with his own family's priceless Valyrian steel greatsword, Ice. So in total, he fought in 5 battles, and it's still kinda hard to gauge his skill level. If you disagree with my placement of below his brother Brandon and above the average highborn fighter trained in a castle with quality steel, let me know where you think he belongs. Remember, this show really gassed him up for no reason other than to make a cool scene. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see y'all soon.